I'm your host, Adam Dudley, and today we're going to discuss migrating from legacy risk-based vulnerability management solutions. Our expert on the topic is Aaron Unterberger, Sales Engineering Director at Nucleus. Welcome, Aaron.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Adam. It's good to be here.
Can you give us a quick take on what we think constitutes legacy RBVM, because we need to know that as a starting point?
Legacy RBVM, there's a couple of tools that have been in the space for a while. And kind of early stage vulnerability management is very much focused on having visibility or aggregation of data, which is extremely important. But as the technologies have evolved and as use cases have evolved, what we're finding is that the legacy tooling doesn't necessarily meet all of those use cases or requires a significant effort to be able to address those use cases. So in some cases, legacy tooling might only focus on CVE-based vulnerabilities.
Okay.
They don't really have a strong methodology for prioritization of non-CVE-based vulnerabilities and kind of normalizing across different findings types. And then there are also some tools where they've been built as kind of a basic application foundation. With a lot of extensibility, but it requires a heavy degree of implementation to accommodate additional integrations, additional systems. So as we start looking at SAST, DAST, SCA, CSPM, pulling in asset inventory, providing a modern way of prioritization, which often includes adding in business context as well as vulnerability intelligence. That can take a significant effort in implementing.
What are you seeing out there in terms of, what kind of resources are required to address that heavy customization lift with these older tools?
Oftentimes, the resourcing is pretty heavy. It's usually full implementation teams, requires pretty significant development work. Oftentimes, you're actually implementing capabilities programmatically. Or in some cases, tools, you have to externalize functionality to get all the use cases addressed, right? In which case you're also doing custom development. Typically, we'll see implementation timelines between 6 months to over a year, and costs can also be significant. The challenge is that often you're spending resources on building and maintaining a customized system versus using something that's off of the shelf and being able to then focus on your resources for the actual remediation and reduction of risk for the business.
Share some ideas, about why an organization would want to transition away from maybe a legacy RBVM solution that they already implemented. Maybe they've resourced it, they have those resources in place to maintain it. Why would they want to migrate to more modern approaches?
Yeah, so there's a number of factors that might go into that. One major factor is the data landscape is changing quite a bit. So when we think about vulnerability management today, findings can come from a smattering of different sources, right? So they're not just CVE-based vulnerabilities. We're also looking at shift left and application security starting to come into play, which oftentimes doesn't include CVE-based findings. For example, DAST findings usually aren't CVE-based. You also see things like CSPM or Cloud Security Posture Management, where these are more so looking at configurations on assets and specifically within the cloud, and in general, just configuration scanning across the enterprise. Oftentimes, poor configurations are a major cause of exploit or vulnerability, right? Using default passwords or default certificates or low entropy cryptography, right? So these are all things that can be vulnerabilities down the road and aren't necessarily an inherent flaw in the technology that you're using, but instead how technology is being configured. All of these are kind of modern systems or sources of findings. There can also be manual findings or assessment style findings for things like pen testing or vulnerability assessments, code reviews, what have you. All of these can also bring forth new findings into the enterprise, and all of those potentially represent risk to the organization. And all of them have a similar process of analysis, prioritization, triage, remediation, and mitigation, as well as verification that stuff has been fixed, reporting and improving on that cycle and kind of iterating through it. All of these different findings have that similar life cycle, but aren't necessarily fitting into that clear, clean definition of a CVE-based vulnerability.
CVE is only associated with a certain percentage of findings, and then there's this whole world out there of other types of findings that don't necessarily have a CVE attached. So any system that's exclusively focused on CVEs in any kind of scale enterprise, you're really going to be missing a lot. Is that right?
Yeah. And so another facet, speaking of missing a lot, so another facet is with CVE-based vulnerabilities, there's a ton of research that goes into CVEs, and you've got really great resources like Sysakev, you've got EPSS, you have Mandiant, Recorded Future, really great organizations that are doing quite a bit of analysis into these types of findings. And what we're finding is, while the traditional approach looks at primarily technical risk, primarily CVSS-based scoring, that doesn't necessarily reflect how an enterprise prioritizes, right? And when you think about the sheer volume of findings, even within the CVSS or CVE event space, the number of findings is vast. And oftentimes, there are too many findings to address when just simply looking at CVSS-based technical risk. And so, or I should say technical severity. And so also organizations are finding that they need to get more effective with how they prioritize, looking at how technical risk might factor in other variables and then translate to actual business risk. Another area that we find traditional RBVM being challenged is either the prioritization models are black box or they're highly customized, where maybe they're implemented programmatically. And so it's kind of two extremes of a spectrum of something's extremely simple, but maybe it doesn't factor in key factors that are important to an organization because it's black box, right? You've abstracted out the complexity, but you've also removed any ability of understanding the model or customizing the model to a specific organization, right? So some organizations maybe have a certain approach that they manage end-of-life assets, or there might be specific compliance requirements that an organization has to do business.
Right.
And so those are key attributes of how they would prioritize that might get abstracted away in a black box prioritization model. And so what we're finding is that there's a little bit of a sweet spot where there's a framework that factors in key attributes and traits, and then giving the ability to prioritize or deprioritize elements of that framework versus defining the framework entirely from scratch, right? Yeah. So both extremes are challenging, and really it's kind of that Goldilocks state of having something that is abstracted enough to where you don't need to have a data science team to implement, but is flexible enough to accommodate the nuances of your organization.
What have you seen in terms of, because we migrated a lot of customers off of legacy risk-based vulnerability management. So, what does that process look like? Let's say a new customer has been using, one of the tools using the older approaches. What are some of the key things that go into a migration project?
Yeah, it's very similar to a implementation with, somebody who maybe is just using a manual or swivel chair process. Where oftentimes we're looking at systems mapping and migration. So, what systems do you have findings in? In some cases, we talked about how there are systems that are focused solely on, CVE-based and network-based vulnerabilities. So oftentimes there might be new systems that we're adding in, but identifying where are those systems of identifying findings and then getting those into a tool like Nucleus. Once you've done the initial systems migration or ingestion and connectivity, setup of connectivity, then that's where the next stage is identifying the kind of asset data mapping, layering in business context, which is really critical part of prioritization, is understanding, what assets present risk to the organization, whether it be that they're externally facing, or if they're mission critical, or they have sensitive data on it, or maybe they're in scope for stringent requirements around compliance. So identifying those assets and classifying those assets accordingly. What we do find is that oftentimes organizations that have legacy tooling, to some degree, have a grasp of that type of information, but it isn't necessarily comprehensive, right? So again, it's working out what are those data sources, how do we correlate those into our asset records, and how do we properly organize our asset data. Once you've built out the kind of business context and asset context, then the next piece is looking at workflow prioritization, right? And there's different workflows across different teams. So across application security, across network security, endpoint, right? All of those different teams that are managing vulnerabilities, you can then start to roll out those processes, workflows, prioritization, et cetera, with those teams. And then finally, reporting, right? So understanding how do we view how each team is doing? How do we give them meaningful reports and information to summarize and encapsulate what their teams are doing, how their teams are doing, and then also how do we provide an executive level of visibility for executive level stakeholders that are going to care more about organizational risk, that are going to care more about maybe how their business units are doing, or how broader application teams or managing directors or large management teams or large teams are performing. So then also building out reports for those audiences. Once you have that in place, it's, as we know, it's an iterative approach or iterative process. And so you can then start to optimize and improve. Often where we see optimization and improvement is within Nucleus, we bring a wealth of information around vulnerability prioritization and vulnerability intelligence, right? So a really, really great example is Mandiant. Comes with the Nucleus subscription. We're also piping in SysAkev and EPSS, which are also really great vulnerability intelligence feeds for kind of predictive risk. So organizations aren't used to having that information. And so these are ways that you can improve and really focus on what matters to the organization and to the business.